Hello, in this video we're going to look at how you can move from CI/CD, traditional CI/CD, to GitOps, and how you're going to, what the steps are that you need to think of. You're going to learn about what GitOps actually is and how it can help you to automate your way to production. Let's first remind what traditional CI/CD actually means. Traditional CI/CD means that you have a combination of a continuous integration pipeline and a continuous deployment or continuous delivery pipeline. That means that you have a tool, GitHub Actions, code pipeline, code build, GitLab, whatever kind of CI/CD tool that you're using today to actually execute your deployments to the different environments that you have. You usually start with a continuous integration pipeline on the left-hand side, where you actually run unit tests, security scans, and all of that kind of stuff. There's a bunch of videos in my channel that you can look at, which goes into more details. And then you have a continuous delivery pipeline where you actually deploy stuff into the different environments. That's the definition of CI/CD. Now let's move over at defining what GitOps actually is. The way that I actually look at GitOps, it's a combination of Git and operations. And in this case, this means that you have everything that you need is code. Application, infrastructure, target deployment code. Everything is written in code, and you don't have any manual steps or any manual deployments that you actually do. This is a well-known technique in the Kubernetes space, where you actually use GitOps to update your Kubernetes API status as well. For me, this also means that it empowers developers to take actual deployment decisions. And I think this is a key point of GitOps and what it actually means. So if you look at the pipeline without GitOps, you usually have the process that you have a developer that then has a pull request approval, which actually merges the code into the main branch, which then actually triggers a CI/CD pipeline. And then at the end, before you go to production, there's usually a manual approval step. Sometimes also there is something like a change advisory board that is being used to control the changes that go into production. Those people in those caps are usually far away from the technical decisions and understandings of what actually happens. With GitOps, this changes. You actually move the decision to the pull request approval, and the moment that someone merges the pull request, whether it's an application code or whether it's a configuration code, it directly deploys out to production. We're going to look a little bit more into details on what options you have for GitOps, implementing GitOps, and how you actually get to where you want to be or where you could be in order to apply configuration changes in an automated fashion. Why should you actually move to GitOps? GitOps gives you really a possibility to ensure that you can directly see the state of a specific environment or of a target where you're actually going into in your Git repository. It requires you to it doesn't require you to go into the AWS accounts or into the target deployments accounts. It really gives you that one view. If there is an incident, you can look at the current state of the environment when going into Git. You can also see all of the changes either in configuration or in source code that have been implemented to a specific environments, because you can see it in the Git history. So it brings the current status of an operational environment close to the developer. And I think this really changes the way that we actually look at the ownership model. If you think of, you want to do you build it, you run it. That really means that the developers need to also maintain what you have in your day-to-day environment, and this means you need to get close to them to ensure that they can actually take the responsibility and the ownership of what they have been building against. So I think this is one of the biggest benefits of using GitOps, and that's why I'm also at the moment encouraging to go into that direction. For me, what it also means to move to true GitOps is that all of the state of all of your environments is actually in Git. The deployment is fully in the control of a system or a tool. And the configuration changes that you actually do for an environment also trigger a redeployment of the relevant environment. Starting a deployment actually means merging a pull request. And this is not only for the development environments, but also for the production environments. And then there is no manual intervention at any stage of the deployment process. So let's look at how do you get from traditional CI/CD pipelines to using GitOps. And there's 100 different flavors on how you actually can get there. First of all, Analyze your current CI/CD pipelines. Understand and look at where actually you have manual steps as part of the deployment, where you're triggering deployments or promotions with a manual fashion. Analyze what the configuration parameters that you need for all of your environments, because those are the ones that you will later need to pull into configuration as code that you can then use to actually trigger your GitOps pipelines. As an example, if you have 3 environments where you promote your changes to, how do you actually implement them in your Git repository, in your Git structure, which will actually trigger the redeployment? So this means point number 2 is you need to identify the configuration, right? How do you want to and need to configure your CI/CD flow? What's the repository structure that you actually need to maintain all of the environments that you need? And that's something that in some of the projects that I've been working with, we already did as we had problems with. I also have a session on my YouTube talking about the right repository structure and why it is important to get this repository structure right if you want to implement through GitOps. Then as the next step, you will need to choose your GitOps tool or a methodology. There is 100 different possibilities once again on how to implement that. In the Kubernetes space, the most common ones are using ArgoCD or using Flux CD. But if you're not on the Kubernetes space, you can actually implement a GitOps-like thing with using any traditional CI/CD tool like GitHub Actions or Code Pipeline again, or Code Catalyst. You can implement the same methodologies in triggering the right set of workflows in an automated fashion after something is merged. This is what number 4 means here, right? You need to implement the required automations and triggers. As an example, if you're using ArgoCD, there is no need to actually implement any watching of the repository. ArgoCD automatically resyncs every time that you change something to the repository and gets a webhook, receives a webhook to actually trigger the redeployment. You can implement the same thing with Code Pipeline, with GitHub Actions or any other tool, but it's a little bit more complicated because you need to actually implement these retriggers yourself, and you need to then decide which of the pipelines or CI/CD flows or flows that you actually have should be retriggered if a certain configuration change is being done. As an example, think of you have a repository structure where you have one folder for each of the environments that you have. You now need to ensure that the moment that you change something in the dev folder, only the promotion and deployment workflow gets triggered. If you have a change in the production folder, you only need to trigger the promotion flow and to actually change and redeploy the promotion environment and production environment. So there is a little bit more things that you need to do if you go into that implementing that part of the flow. In the AWS world, there is only an implementation of GitOps Lite, the way that I would call that today. CloudFormation has a possibility to implement a GitOps Git sync, where you can actually directly pull and retrigger deployment. This is not really well implemented, and there is not enough details on the feedback that is actually done. You then have the Code Catalyst possibilities to run workflows. There is CI/CD pipelines that can react on push to a certain repository, so you can implement GitOps with that, but there is no really example templates right now available in Code Catalyst on how to implement that. With Code Pipeline v2, most of the changes that have been implemented since 2024, there's a lot of possibilities to implement something like a GitOps structure, but here Code Pipeline is still too slow sometimes. Recent changes like deploying to EC2 instance natively or deploying to Kubernetes natively, where we also created some videos around that, make it a little bit simpler to actually implement the GitOps-like scenario, because Code Pipeline natively can execute deployment steps instead of going through code build. So that's a good positive movement, but it's also still not enough, not giving enough faster feedback loops for the developers that actually use this. And it's really hard at the moment to set up code pipelines in your own environment. Then last but not least, AWS has been heavily investing into Canoe, which is a tool to build internal developer platforms, and it summarizes all of the most common GitOps tools. So you can use that as an entry point as well. I hope you're leaving this video with a few learnings around what GitOps actually is, how you implement it, and why you should implement it within your organization. If you have any follow-up questions or want to know details on how GitOps can change the way that you deploy your cloud applications, please let us know in the comments and we will get back to you.